The French military doesn't operate like most Western armies, and that's not an accident. It's a deliberate strategic choice rooted in France's unique position within the global power structure. While the United States maintains over 800 military bases worldwide and projects force through carrier strike groups, France has quietly built something different. A force designed not for global domination, but for surgical intervention in spaces where American power either won't go or can't effectively operate. This matters because France remains the only European nation with genuine expeditionary capability, the only one that can deploy thousands of troops to African battlefields within 72 hours without asking Washington for logistical support. But here's what makes this truly significant from an economic and geopolitical standpoint. France's military structure is intimately tied to its post-colonial relationships, particularly across Francophone Africa, where 14 nations still use the CFA franc, a currency guaranteed by the French treasury. This isn't just military strategy. It's the armed component of a broader economic system that has survived decolonization. The French understand something fundamental that pure military spending often obscures. Power isn't just about firepower or troop numbers. It's about maintaining strategic influence in regions that feed resources into your economic system. When you look at France's military on paper, it seems almost contradictory. They have fewer active personnel than Turkey, a smaller defense budget than Saudi Arabia, and they can't match the technological sophistication of American systems in many categories. Yet France remains one of only a handful of nations capable of conducting full-spectrum military operations entirely independently, from intelligence gathering to logistics to actual combat deployment anywhere on the planet. This paradox isn't a weakness. It's the entire point. France designed its military not to win a hypothetical great power conflict, but to maintain influence in a very specific way that serves very specific economic and political interests that have been carefully cultivated since the supposed end of colonialism. Let's start with something most people don't consider when they think about military effectiveness. France is the only country in Europe with a complete defense industrial base. They don't need to import fighter jets from the United States. They build their own Rafales. They don't rely on German tanks or British naval systems. They produce their own Leclerc tanks, their own Frem frigates, their own nuclear submarines, and critically, their own nuclear weapons. This isn't just about national pride or independence for its own sake. This is about maintaining the capacity to act without permission, without coordination, without having to clear operations through NATO command structures or wait for American approval. When France decided to intervene in Mali in 2013, they didn't convene a coalition or seek United Nations authorization first. They moved unilaterally, because they had both the capability and the will to protect what they perceived as their interests in the Sahel region. Now, why does this matter economically? Because France's military interventions, particularly in Africa, aren't random humanitarian missions or abstract commitments to international stability. They're directly tied to resource extraction, currency control, and the preservation of economic relationships that date back to the colonial era but have been modernized and repackaged for the 21st century. Let's talk about the CFA franc for a moment, because you cannot understand French military strategy without understanding this monetary system. 14 African countries use the CFA franc, which is pegged to the euro and guaranteed by the French treasury. This means these nations hold their foreign reserves in France, which means France has direct access to those reserves, which means France maintains significant influence over the monetary policy of roughly 180 million people across Central and West Africa. When instability threatens one of these nations, when a coup happens or when insurgent groups gain territory, France doesn't just see a humanitarian crisis or a political problem. They see a potential disruption to this entire economic architecture. This is why French special forces were on the ground in Chad within hours when rebels threatened the capital in 2019. This is why France maintains permanent military bases in Djibouti, Gabon, Senegal, and Ivory Coast. These aren't symbolic presences. These are operational hubs designed to project power rapidly across regions where French economic interests are concentrated. The United States has bases everywhere because it seeks global hegemony. France has bases in very specific places because it seeks to maintain a very specific form of regional influence that serves very specific economic functions. But here's where it gets really interesting from a structural standpoint. France's military is small enough to be affordable, large enough to be effective in the conflicts it's actually designed to fight, and flexible enough to operate in environments where conventional American military power would be either inappropriate or ineffective. Think about this carefully. The American military is optimized for high-intensity conventional warfare against peer competitors. It's built to fight China in the Pacific or Russia in Eastern Europe. It's not particularly well suited for counterinsurgency in the Sahel or rapid intervention in small African nations where the entire conflict might involve a few thousand combatants scattered across terrain the size of Texas. France's military, by contrast, is specifically designed for exactly these kinds of operations. They maintain a high proportion of professional soldiers rather than conscripts. They emphasize special operations capabilities. They've invested heavily in airlift capacity relative to their size. And they've built institutional knowledge about operating in former colonies that the United States simply doesn't possess. This difference in military design reflects a difference in strategic purpose, which itself reflects a difference in economic structure. The United States uses its military to maintain the dollar as the global reserve currency, to keep sea lanes open for international trade, to enforce a rules-based international order that benefits American corporations and financial institutions. France uses its military to maintain influence in regions where it still extracts significant economic value, where French corporations operate, where French currency circulates, and where French political relationships provide leverage in international forums. These are two different projects entirely, and they require two different kinds of military forces. Now let's address the nuclear question, because this is absolutely central to understanding French strategic autonomy. France has roughly 300 nuclear warheads, which sounds like a lot, until you compare it to the American arsenal of over 5,000, or the Russian stockpile of similar size. But here's what matters. France's nuclear arsenal is entirely independent. They don't rely on American technology, American delivery systems, or American command structures. This gives France something that no other European nation possesses: the ultimate insurance policy against existential threats and the ultimate leverage in negotiations. When France threatens to use force or makes demands in international negotiations, there's always the implicit understanding that they are a nuclear power acting independently, not a client state relying on American extended deterrence. This changes the entire calculation. Consider what happened in 2003 when France opposed the American invasion of Iraq. Germany opposed it too, but Germany's opposition was largely symbolic because Germany doesn't have an independent military capability that matters at the global level. France's opposition carried weight because France could, theoretically, act independently in the Middle East if it chose to. France had relationships with Iraq going back decades. French companies had contracts there. French intelligence services operated there. When France said no to the invasion, it wasn't just expressing a moral position. It was protecting tangible economic and strategic interests with the implicit backing of an independent military force. Let's talk about the Foreign Legion for a moment, because this institution perfectly encapsulates France's unique approach to military power. The French Foreign Legion is essentially a mercenary force that operates under French command, composed of foreign nationals who gain French citizenship through military service. This is extraordinary when you think about it. France maintains a military unit that deliberately recruits non-French soldiers, puts them through brutal training, deploys them to the most dangerous missions, and uses them as a force that can operate with a degree of deniability that regular French troops cannot. When Foreign Legion units deploy to Africa, when they conduct operations in places like the Central African Republic or Mali, the French government can maintain a certain distance from the political fallout. These aren't French citizens dying in foreign wars, at least not initially. This gives France operational flexibility that other democracies don't have, because the domestic political cost of casualties is partially mitigated. But beyond the Foreign Legion, France has invested heavily in special operations forces that operate across Africa with minimal publicity and maximum effect. These aren't large deployments. We're talking about teams of a dozen soldiers working with local forces, providing intelligence, calling in airstrikes, training proxy armies. This is the kind of warfare that doesn't make headlines, that doesn't require parliamentary approval for every operation, that can be sustained indefinitely without significant public opposition. The United States does this too, of course, but France has been doing it longer in these specific regions and with deeper institutional knowledge of local politics, local languages, and local power structures. Now, here's the uncomfortable truth that we need to confront directly. France's military effectiveness in Africa is built on relationships that were forged during colonialism and have been maintained through a combination of economic dependency, military cooperation, and when necessary, direct intervention. When we talk about France training African militaries, we're not talking about altruistic capacity building. We're talking about creating forces that share French operational procedures, use French equipment, rely on French logistics, and ultimately serve French strategic interests. When a French-trained army in an African nation faces an insurgency and that army calls for French support, France doesn't respond because of abstract humanitarian concerns. France responds because those relationships, those dependencies, are the infrastructure of French influence. This becomes especially clear when you look at where France intervenes and where it doesn't. France sent thousands of troops to Mali when jihadist groups threatened to overrun the country. Why? Because Mali is a former colony, because it uses the CFA franc, because French uranium company Areva has interests in neighboring Niger, because instability in Mali threatens the entire Sahel region, where France maintains significant influence. But France didn't intervene in Rwanda in 1994 until it was far too late, and even then the intervention was controversial and possibly counterproductive. Why? Because the political calculation was different, because the Rwandan government at the time had shifted toward English-speaking allies, because French interests there were less clearly defined. This isn't about morality, this is about interest, calculated precisely and pursued consistently. Let's examine the defense industrial base more carefully because this is where French strategy really diverges from the American model in crucial ways. The United States has a defense industry that serves multiple purposes simultaneously. It generates profits for contractors, it provides jobs in congressional districts, it develops technology that has civilian applications, and it produces weapon systems for export to allies and partners. The French defense industry is smaller, more concentrated, and more directly tied to strategic autonomy. When France develops a fighter jet like the Rafale, the primary goal isn't to sell it to dozens of countries around the world, although export sales certainly matter. The primary goal is to ensure that France never has to depend on American or Russian aircraft, never has to clear operations with foreign governments that control critical technology, never has to worry about spare parts or maintenance support being cut off during a crisis. This becomes especially important when you consider that France regularly conducts operations that the United States opposes or views skeptically. France has maintained relationships with Syria even during periods of American hostility. France has pursued independent policies in Lebanon, in Libya, across the Middle East and Africa. If France relied on American aircraft, American satellites, American intelligence systems, these independent policies would be functionally impossible. The United States could simply threaten to cut off support, and French operational capability would collapse. By maintaining indigenous production of critical systems, France preserves the option to act independently, which is the entire foundation of its strategic culture. Now, we need to talk about what this means in the current moment as the global order shifts and traditional alliances come under strain. France is watching the United States become increasingly unpredictable, increasingly focused on great power competition with China, increasingly unwilling to commit resources to what Washington views as peripheral regions. This creates both risks and opportunities for France. The risk is that American security guarantees in Europe become less reliable, which is why France has been pushing for greater European strategic autonomy, for a European army that doesn't depend on NATO structures. The opportunity is that as America pulls back from certain regions, France can expand its influence in spaces that Washington no longer prioritizes. Look at what's happening in the Sahel right now. American interest in counterterrorism operations in Africa has declined significantly since the height of the War on Terror. The United States has reduced its presence, closed bases, shifted resources toward other priorities. France has maintained its presence, even expanded it in some respects, because French interests there haven't changed. Those interests aren't primarily about fighting terrorism. They're about maintaining influence, protecting economic relationships, ensuring that the CFA franc zone remains stable, guaranteeing that uranium flows north, that trade relationships continue, that French companies can operate. The terrorism is real, the threat is genuine, but the French military response is shaped by these broader strategic and economic considerations. This is what Richard Wolff would call understanding the material base beneath the ideological superstructure. When France talks about fighting terrorism, about promoting stability, about supporting democracy, we need to look at what material interests are actually being served. Not because French rhetoric is uniquely dishonest. All nations deploy ideological justifications for strategic actions, but because understanding the material base allows us to predict behavior, to see patterns, to comprehend why France intervenes where it does and ignores crises elsewhere. The French military makes perfect sense once you understand it as an instrument designed to maintain a specific form of post-colonial economic influence that has proven remarkably durable and profitable for French capital, even as the formal structures of empire have dissolved.